So Lean Canvas, I imagine pretty much everybody in this room has heard about it. Who's familiar with Lean Canvas here? Put their hands up. Okay, so not absolutely everybody. Let's start off with well, thank you for coming, like Oliver said, but business plans. So business plans, you might have heard of them before. You have to talk to investors. What are you going to do in the next 5 years? Where are you going to make your money? And at the end of the day, they're very thick, dense documents which are invaluable for creating an effective strategy of what you're going to do in the future, determining what kind of funding you need and what you're going to spend it on, and attracting investors. At the end of the day, it's almost like a proof of concept to investors to show that you've put in the effort and then you know what you're doing, and this isn't just some idea that you thought about last weekend and you're coming in here. So for startups, it's not very applicable. Like Steve Blank, which is one of the people that kind of pioneered the Lean Canvas, says that it's really a document that they make you write, but the investors really just kind of skim through it just to make sure that you've done the work. So ultimately with Lean Canvas, lean, trying to cut the fat, eliminate the waste, they're making it more kind of focused and prioritizing the most important things for a startup. At this point where you're still validating your idea, validating all these different factors of your business, you don't really want to get into the weeds and spend all this time doing stuff that ultimately might change. Your product might change, your customer segment might change, so you have to constantly stay lean and agile. So Lean Canvas is ultimately adapted by a very popular business model plan by Alexander Osterwalder, and it consists of like 9 independent blocks of different concepts that span both your product, what you're giving out, and the market, how you're going to get it. So I'm just going to quickly go through it, the different concepts, how you have to put time and effort into thinking about them, and then we'll go through an activity, kind of collaborative, where people can bounce ideas off each other, and we can start putting some more stuff on paper. So this is the full Lean Canvas. As you see, like on the left is more the product side, your costs, how are you going to be measuring the success of your product and the solution, and ultimately the problem you're solving. And then on the right, you have more the market. So how do you compare with other people? What kind of customer segment are you targeting? And that whole jazz. So first, the problem. It's on the top left, the first thing you see. Ultimately, you have to be solving a problem. And it's very important to keep that in mind, because with a lot of startups, maybe they're providing a cool product or they're doing this revolutionary thing, but they'll ultimately be unsuccessful if they're not addressing an issue that people have. It might be an issue that they didn't know they had, but you have to think about what problem do they need solving and how that directly solves the problem. So defining this can help your business be aligned, and it can stop you from like straying away too far from what a consumer would actually want. So always keep that problem in mind, because with no problem, you have no product. Customer segment. This is ultimately interlinked with your problem, since you have to make sure who your customers are to be able to define their specific problems. So these come hand in hand, but it's really important to understand that you're not selling to the entire population of the earth. You have a type of person in mind, and as you'll learn further down the program with like user personas, that also comes into marketing and designing the user experience to make sure that you're focused and you know who you're trying to target. Unique value proposition. So this is almost a catchphrase that you'll use to investors. It's what makes you different. There's always going to be competition, especially nowadays. So you have to make sure that you differentiate yourself and you're giving the customer a reason to either buy or invest in your service or product. So it's good to kind of have a think and definitely compare yourself to a lot of people, because when you're in the market, that's what you're going to be compared on, whether it's on price or on the features you give. You have to make sure you have like a unique value proposition that you can justify, not just to yourself, but also to possible consumers. Your solution, this should be hand in hand with the problem you've identified. That's why it's best to not think of a solution before you've thought of a problem. Sometimes, depending on what you've identified as a problem, you can realize that the solution that you're providing isn't completely accurate. So there's a really good book called Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and he says like there's something called like the Lean Startup cycle, which is like learning, building, and measuring. And this is a constant feedback loop that you should always keep in mind, whether it's like on a big scale, creating your MVPs, measuring its performance, and then building a new MVP, learning from your past mistakes, or even from a very, very small scale, maybe having a customer segment that you thought was the one that you were targeting, building something to provide for them, then measuring the performance and like kind of traction that's good, and then learning that maybe that's not the customer segment that you're kind of providing for. So this is a very good thing to just cement in your brain, and I really recommend that book because it shows that you're constantly iterating, and if you just focus on one type of solution and you're sold on that and you never change it, you're destined to fail. Because ultimately, at this point in your startup kind of career, you're not entirely sure what the customer wants, and you have a good idea, and that's why you have amazing ideas and you made it on the program. But it's always subject to change, and you have to make sure that you kind of keep that in mind. Channels. So that's how you're going to get your solution, your product or service out to your targeted customer segments. Early on, it's important to not just focus on what's going to give you the most returns, like how can you reach the most people, but it's also how can you learn from your customer segment. So if you're doing, I don't know, paid ads on Instagram, that might be good for validation, but you're not getting a lot of feedback. But if you're doing an email list where you're asking for feedback and you're asking people to have like go through a further barrier to maybe sign up to see that they actually want the product, you're learning more from your customers. So remember that it's important to, in these early stages, learn and really validate your idea, right, rather than trying to reach as many people as possible, because that comes at later stages and you don't really want to waste all that time and effort right now. So revenue streams, that's one of the most important parts. It's all nice that you have an idea, but you have to think, how will you properly monetize? And there's like a few factors that you have to start thinking about. Further down the line, when stakes get a little bit higher, it is important to properly sit down, but it's good to have a general idea early on. So the key kind of self-explanatory concepts is first cost. How much does it cost you to make or maintain the product or service you're providing? That's always going to be a nice foundation to be like, okay, I obviously can't sell lower than this. Selling it, a lot of people focus on just the production, but they don't understand that there's equal and sometimes a lot of costs involved with not just the marketing, but also the distribution, depending on what type of company you have. That could be like delivery fees, or it could be maintenance for whatever like web application you have. Competitors are also a very good way of kind of maybe understanding the landscape and how you would fit in. So if you have similar competitors that are offering similar features, you can understand that you obviously can't price higher than that, because then there wouldn't be any competition between you. But you can understand, maybe I'm providing a more cost-effective option, or if you have competitors that don't have as much features, you can maybe price a little bit higher. So it's always good to scope out competitors and understand where they are in the market. And finally, something that's really interesting is see if you're providing a quantifiable benefit to the customer. I know this doesn't apply to all startups, but if you can quantify the amount of like value that your users are getting from using your product, then you can draw a straight line between that and what you price for it. Cost structure. So this, as a startup, it's very easy to kind of let it go, because you're constantly trying to create your MVP and get out there. But it's really important to not just properly note what you're spending on right now, but what you're going to spend on the future. So running costs are one of the things that are the most detrimental for some startups, because they're kind of in the background, and even maybe if you're not working on it, or you're working on side as a side, like a part-time thing, it can accumulate. So make sure that you understand like what you're spending overheads on, and ultimately how much will it cost to create an MVP. Taking into account the lean startup cycle, you will create multiple MVPs through your startup career, but always focus on what's ahead of you. And it's really good to break down and kind of validate each step in the process, so you make sure that the solution that you're picking to create your MVP is the cheapest one, or is the most effective. You could always go wrong, where if you're developing an app, you look at the first freelancer you can find online and you're like, oh, that's what it costs to create an app. But it's really important to validate those findings and understand whether this is the most effective way to create your MVP. So the ultimate goal is to make sure that your revenue surpasses your costs. Early on, most businesses don't make a profit until like 5 years in. So don't completely focus on trying to make a profit, but it's important to keep yourself afloat. And that revenue doesn't just come from users. You can also justify it. It comes from the grants or the accelerator funding, or if you eventually get investments, just keep an eye on that. And key metrics that funnels in again to the lean startup cycle. It's always important to know and to define what defines success in your business. So the more you know about how your business is doing, the more informed decisions you'll make. And in another way of saying it, it's if you're tracking how well performance, like your business is performing, you'll know what's working and what's not. If you implemented something new and you didn't see a rise in users or a rise in adoption, then you know that you shouldn't keep doing that. So it's always good to not just focus on brand new solutions and developing those, but validating that they actually work. There's something called the pirate metrics, because somebody who's funnier than me, are like a pirate, I guess. I don't know. But these are good metrics to kind of keep in your belt, in your tool belt. So acquisition, how much does it cost and how many users are you acquiring into your business? Activation, ultimately, like if your user enjoys one happy visit, and they're likely to be repeat customers. So it's good to track whether the users are actually satisfied with your product, because ultimately for a lot of your startups, that's when it's going to keep like repeat customers. And that links into retention, where you want to see whether your customers are coming into the website once or using your product once, or they're actually adopting it for the long term. Referral is also really important. Word of mouth is one of the best marketing strategies because it's relatively free, and it only really works if you have a really good product. So it's good to make track of that. If you see referrals going up, maybe you're on the right track. And then revenue, of course, it's one of the easiest metrics to handle, because you're always going to be thinking about the amount of money you have. But it also, like, you shouldn't use any one of these metrics independently, but together they allow you to paint a really good picture on not just how your business is doing now, but how it's done in the past. And it's really good to track that kind of progress. And your unfair advantage, this is a little bit similar to like your unique value proposition, but it's less for investors and more for you. So how do you stand out from the competition, and what aspect are you going to be focusing on? You don't want to just create another, if you're creating a social media platform, you don't want to create another Twitter. You're not going to be able to do that because there's already heavy competition in the market. So what are you doing to make yourself different, and how will you convince somebody else? So a good way of looking at it is that your only real competitive advantage is something that cannot be copied or cannot be bought. Ultimately, that doesn't just have to be part of your product or idea that you're putting forth. It can also be part of who you are as a founder or the capabilities that you have. So for example, if I'm creating a new social media platform for students, it doesn't have to be my idea of a social platform for students that's my unfair advantage. It can be my networking opportunities I have within campus and the connections I have with student relationship like organizations. That's my unfair advantage, and that's why I'm going to be able to excel. So now that you know that, you can leverage it and you can exploit it, instead of, in that case, maybe focusing on like newspaper marketing, which is not playing to your strengths. So just a top tip, like I've said before, always validate your assumptions. The most important thing to do with Lean Canvas is fill it out. And a lot of those things you have thought about before, maybe not in this kind of structured way, but you have thought about how are you going to make money? How are you going to reach your customers? But it's important to fill it all out and then identify what is the riskiest part of the business. The good thing about this Lean Canvas model is that it puts it all in front of you, so you can look at it and you can understand, actually, I haven't put much effort and thought into what customer segment am I going to do. And once you can analyze the riskiest part of your plan, like in this example, it's the channels. Maybe this company specifically hasn't really thought about how it's going to reach its customers. So then you experiment. You got to validate those assumptions. So what would be one channel that I can use, and let's evaluate the effectiveness. Use the lean cycle. So not just as your MVP and as your product, as I said before, but also to validate. In this idea, you have a channel, maybe we should do email. So you build a nice emailing advertising platform, then you send it, you measure the performance, you understand the data, you understand how it's the retention, the acquisition, all the pirate metrics, and then you learn from it. And then maybe after that, you realize that your product isn't really suited for being sent through email. So you check another channel. So that's the most important part of this entire thing. The Lean Canvas, you can find it online. We'll fill it out together after. And it's very basic stuff, as you can see, but it's important to not just take your assumptions for granted, because it's very easy to be like, oh no, I'll just send it through Instagram ads, or I'll just send it through emails. But it's important to validate those findings and make sure that you're not just taking things as they are, and you're constantly building and adapting. So any questions? Eric Reis, like Reis. He's really good. So he's really good for product management as well, but ultimately, as entrepreneurs, you are product managers for your product, and he uses a lot of. I really do recommend that book. If I saw you probably saw the recommended readings in Notion, and there's like 30 books, and I know you're not going to read 30 books in like 2 weeks, but if you can read any one book, it would probably be that one. It really goes through this like lean cycle, and that's something that can be applicable to pretty much everything in life, and it uses a lot of terms in product management, like, you know, average lifetime cost of a user. And this is good things to kind of keep in mind, because although it's very easy to just be like, okay, I'll just charge my customers this, I'll just, you know, I'll put this amount of money in ads. The more you understand the data and the more you understand, this is how much it costs for me to get a customer, this is how much money I get from a customer, you'll start realizing that, you know, maybe you shouldn't be spending this much on ads, or maybe your pricing strategy is wrong. So it's a very good book to get you kind of started in starting to define these kind of key metrics, like I said before, that will be very helpful. Because you, just like, you know, if you're a doctor, you aren't going to prescribe pills or give a certain treatment with diagnosing and understanding the body of the patient you're treating. And just as a startup, you're not going to take new directions and, you know, build new products without understanding what the current situation is and how it's developed from the past. So I really would recommend that book. Really nice.